Hello, 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 hello. And welcome once again to not a Parker Born, but my wrap-up review of Edge of Eternities, or Magic the Gathering. My name is M. Kostler. I am a longtime Magic the Gathering player. Been playing since around Onslaught block. Have taken several breaks in between then and now, but have been back into the game since around Bloomborough. I'm a many-time Mythic standard best of one player. I do some paper Magic the Gathering, primarily Commander, but when I'm talking about the cards, both in the previous set review streams and today, I'm speaking of them primarily from a standard perspective, competitive 60 card standard perspective. I might mention some other 60 card formats when talking about some of these cards. I only know them from afar, so do not take my take what I'm going to say as gospel when talking about some of that stuff. But I feel like I have a pretty good and deep knowledge of the standard format. And I think a lot of the things that I'm going to be talking about with respect to these cards is translates into both best of one and best of three. If there is something that I think is particularly interesting for a card in best of one, I will probably note it out, or if I think that a card is mostly interesting as a sideboard option, then I'll note that out as well. So we've already gone through all of the cards from Edge of Eternities in the EOE set. We didn't look at any of the bonus sheet stuff, nor have I looked at any of the Commander product for this particular set. Because it's I did it for the Final Fantasy set because I have some background with Final Fantasy, and I found the references to be interesting, but just evaluating the Commander cards is not that terribly interesting for me, nor do I think that I'm the right person for you to get that information from. Much better channels such as MTG Goldfish, Command Zone, can give you that perspective. What we're going to be doing here is we're going to be going through, I pulled out, I don't have the exact numbers, but I pulled out a smattering of cards from each of the colors, and we're going to be going in WUBRG order and in set order. Though I did put any of the two colorless cards, the two non-artifact colorless cards, I moved those with the artifacts and the lands. So slightly out of order there. But we're going to be going through just a smattering of cards from each of the colors, multicolor, colorless lands, etc. To talk about things that I think are going to have an impact on standard, whether they are going to spawn new archetypes, whether they're going to slot into existing archetypes, whether they are just options that you might have in deck building, whether they are decent sideboard cards, and then also cards that I think are potentially overhyped or over talked about that aren't really going to see, in my opinion, that much play in the standard. From what I pulled, I didn't pull anything that I thought was like obviously overhyped. That could be the wrong way to do it, because you could obviously be like, I think Cosmogoyf is overhyped. I'm not sure that there actually is that much hype for Cosmogoyf, but it is interesting to put it down into the public record so that if Cosmogoyf does end up being, you know, an incredible card, then you can go back and review and see how foolish you were. But I tried to keep it to things that I thought had seen, you know, some talk. If I were to pull any cards out of that, I tried to talk about it for cards that I think that some people might have evaluated from a competitive perspective much higher than I would have evaluated it from. There's also some cards in here that I'm gonna talk about. Not much to evaluate on, but I wanted to talk about the choices that you might have to make in related to these cards. Lots of rambling preamble for this. Probably could have made that a little more succinct, but let's go ahead and get started with white. We're going to start here with Beyond the Quiet. For 3 white, we have a sorcery at rare, and it just says exile all creatures in spacecraft. I think for the most part, spacecraft are not going to be that relevant for competitive constructed. I think maybe I talk about like 1 or 2 that I think have some play. But for the most part, this is really just 5 mana, exile all creatures. It's kind of... Sunfall is rotating with the rotation, with standard renewal, however they want to call it these days. And if you want my thoughts about cards that are rotating and some of the highlights of cards that are rotating, I did another stream last week where I talked about that, potential replacements and things like that to talk more about things like Sunfall. But this is essentially your Sunfall replacement. And in Standard, right now you have really... At 5, I think you technically have Fumigate from the beginner's box, and then you have there's like a destroy all creatures and vehicles card that was Boros for 5 mana. But really, your options are at 5, Sunfall, which is rotating, this card, which is coming in, and Ultima. Ultima is the same casting cost for sorcery that says destroy all creatures and artifacts. So Ultima would also deal with any spacecraft, since I believe every single spacecraft is an artifact. But Ultima says end the turn as part of its resolution. That does a lot of the same things that exiling cards do, in the sense that if what you're sweeping has death triggers, most notably cards like Heartfire Hero and Cacophony Scamp, Heartfire Hero banned, Cacophony Scamp rotating, but also things like Enduring Curiosity, Enduring Innocence, and Unstoppable Slasher, all things that if they die, then they immediately return to the battlefield, either as an enchantment for the enduring cycle or on the battlefield with 3 stun counters on it, and only return if they don't have any counters on them. So because Ultima was just ending the turn, it was clearing that none of those dies triggers would enter the stack. So it kind of does a lot of the same things that exiling does. Outside of exiling would make it so that those creatures do not end up in the actual graveyard, in case you have some way to recur them, either through a zombify or some kind of raise dead style effect. The big thing with this card and Ultima is Ultima hits all artifacts, and there is a powerful deck, not, you know, like not showing like huge numbers in MTGO standard challenges or anything, but a powerful deck that exists and will exist in the most part post-rotation in Azorius Synthesizer. And from my experience in playing Azorius, both sides of the table, playing Azorius Control and playing Azorius Synthesizer, took both of the decks to Mythic on different seasons. I feel like Ultima takes what would have been a fairly difficult matchup for Control, for most versions of Control that see play these days, where it's not full on draw go. You're not playing a grip of counter spells. You've only got a couple of counter spells, and you're being a lot more proactive in trying to find a way to end the game. You're playing a lot more removal because the powerful threats are much cheaper, and so your opponent will be able to sneak stuff in, so much better to be able to remove it later if it gets snuck in. So the synthesizer matchup ends up being very, very difficult, especially if they are able to get a synthesizer on the battlefield, because your get losts can't hit artifacts, especially in best of one. You're not playing a ton of main deck artifact removal, targeted artifact removal, and your sweepers really only delay the inevitable from your synthesizer opponent. Some synthesizer lists have even gone to the point where they're playing things like the blue-red siege or fire crystal in order to give their things haste, so making sweepers normal sweepers almost completely irrelevant. But something like Ultima, if you're able to just survive long enough, often resolving an Ultima just ends the game for you, and it makes that matchup significantly better for the Control player. I would even say, depending on how many Ultimas you have in your main deck, it might even be a favorable matchup for you. The problem is we will get to another card called Pinnacle Starcage, which is our replacement for, and actually I'm just going to go ahead and move to it right now. You're going to get a little bit of a preview of some of the cards I'm going to talk about. This card, Pinnacle Starcage, 1 white for an artifact at rare. That says when this artifact enters, exile all artifacts and creatures with mana value 2 or less until this artifact leaves the battlefield. And then for 6 white, put each card exiled with this artifact into its owner's graveyard, then create a 2/2 colorless robot artifact creature token for each card put into a graveyard this way, then sacrifice this artifact. For the most part, the 8 mana activated ability is not that relevant. The important thing here is this is kind of the replacement for Temporary Lockdown being rotated. But Temporary Lockdown was an enchantment. This is an artifact. So if you try and play, if you're trying to be Control, it's almost impossible for you to play both Pinnacle Starcage and Ultima. So I feel like the big question that's gonna happen come rotation is, are the synthesizer lists going to stick around? Are they powerful enough to stick around post-rotation? I think they're fine. You'll see them to varying degrees post-rotation, especially on ladder. And so having copies of Ultima is good, but that basically means that you can't play Pinnacle Star Cage. You're going to have to play things like Split Up, which is 1 white, sorcery at rare, choose 1, destroy all tapped creatures, or destroy all untapped creatures. I haven't been a huge fan of Split Up outside of like Jeskai control lists where I can Shiko it back. But just trying to play it in an Azorius control list, I've been much more happy with temporary lockdown style effects. But personally, I feel that the synthesizer matchup, having access to Ultima for the synthesizer matchup means that I'll grin and bear it and play Split Up rather than play Pinnacle Star Cage and get absolutely hosed if I ever have to go Pinnacle Star Cage into Ultima. Your other option as a control player, and it might end up being that this is the better option to go for, especially if the synthesizer lists are not seeing that much play, is to play Pinnacle Star Cage and then rather than play Ultima, play Beyond the Quiet. So mostly wanted to talk about Beyond the Quiet. There's not really for that reason. It's a fairly generic sweeper. It's an exile-based sweeper. You're not getting, unlike Sunfall, you're not getting a token that you can use later to start beating down, but it does a lot of the same things that Sunfall did that people were annoyed about with Sunfall. And there is a deck building question about whether you play Beyond the Quiet and Pinnacle Star Cage or whether you play Split Up and Ultima. I'm going to start with the Split Up Ultima versions and then see where we go from there. All right, let's head on back to Beyond the Quiet, and then let's move back forward to Cosmogrand Zenith. For 2 and a white, we have a creature human soldier at Mythic. It's a 2/4 with whenever you cast your second spell each turn, choose 1. Either create 2 1/1 white human soldier creature tokens, or put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. I think this card's pretty good. I don't think that it is like busted or anything. I think where this card fits is sort of your top end. You can kind of argue that this is your replacement for Knight Errant of Eos in your Boros Convoke lists. They're not really Convoke anymore because there's not really... There might be like 1 Convoke card still in Standard, but 1 or 2, but you're not going to be with Knight Errant gone. There's no real Convoke things going on for that deck. But this, I say that it kind of replaces that because it's a way for you to generate bodies onto the battlefield in kind of the same way that Knight Errant of Eos drew you cards, which is mostly just putting more bodies on the battlefield for your eventual Imodane's Recruiter big swing. This both generates tokens and lets your tokens get larger, lets everybody get larger when you're going for your final swings. And I think you can't really play this in some sort of mid-range strategy. You need to be in like a White Weenie or a Boros Tokens type strategy with Cosmogrand Zenith because you really want to be getting that double spell in. Very similar to Corey Steelcutter, nowhere near as powerful as Corey Steelcutter, but I think this is going to be a card that you should experiment with, especially if you were a Boros or Jeskai Convoke player with prior to rotation. Next, we have dual Sun Adepts for 2 and a white. We have a Future Human Soldier with, at uncommon, is a 2/2 with double strike. Really, I'm only bringing this card up here because it's a fairly cheap way for you to have a creature with double strike. And I think if you are trying to still do the sort of Boros Prowess, Boros Fling, that kind of, pump spell based aggro deck, this is a card that you can certainly get away with playing, because this will, with your pump spells, this will kill your opponent very, very quickly. That's really the only deck that I would see you playing a card like this in, but I did want to point it out. Next is Halia. I'm going to say Halia. Halia, Guided by Light, for 2 and a white. We have a legendary creature, Human Soldier at rare. She is a 3/3 with whenever Halia or another creature or artifact you control enters, gain 1 life. And at the beginning of your end step, draw a card if you gain 3 or more life this turn, and it has warp for a single white. I'm going to assume that looking at this overall review, you're familiar with the set mechanics, so I'm not going to go over exactly the mechanics of warp in detail here. I think this card is pretty darn good in both your sort of mono white or Orzhov like Ajani's Pridemate life gain style decks. This provides card draw in a deck that really doesn't have a ton of that in its current form. Some versions of that deck do play cards like Exemplar of Light if they're going that high up in their mana cost, but a lot of them kind of stop at 3, and they're really just trying to curve out and kill you before the game goes on long enough. And because this sort of has that gaffer effect of if you've gained at least 3 or more life, you can draw a card. This works fairly well with both other Soul Sister style effects, your Hinterland Sanctifiers, your Case the Uneaten Feasts, and things like I think it's Leonin Arbiter. It's the 1-drop that if you have it 3 or more creatures, you gain a life. So putting all that together, it's going to be fairly easy for you to consistently gain life turn after turn and be able to churn through your deck so that you don't, if your opponent is able to deal with your board, is able to sweep, you have the ability to redeploy post sweeper. I also think that this could see some play in your more Orzhov versions of the life gain strategy, even maybe like your Orzhov Bats style decks, Orzhov mid-range style decks. Being a 3-drop means that this can be picked up by Zorleen from the graveyard. Being a 3-drop means this can be picked up with a card like Lively Dirge. The life gain, you can use things like Starscape Cleric to turn that into life loss for your opponent. So I think this works both pretty well with your aggressive mono white versions of life gain and your sort of more mid-rangey versions of life gain, your more Orzhov versions of life gain. And being able to warp this out for like a big turn to boost up a Essence Channeler or Ajani's Pridemate, or sort of try to do a combo turn with a Starscape Cleric. Just a fairly good card overall. Next, I want to talk about Hard Light Containment. For a single white, we have an enchantment aura at rare. Enchant artifact you control. When this aura enters, exile target creature an opponent controls until this aura leaves the battlefield. An enchant permanent has ward 1. So this is kind of Sheltered by Ghost-esque, but for only 1 mana. The important part of it being only 1 mana is that this is tutorable by Bright Glass Gearhulk. And Bright Glass Gearhulk itself is an artifact. So if that Bright Glass Gearhulk is the only thing that you have on the battlefield, you can still use it to be in the same way that you would use a Sheltered by Ghosts to remove something. You can use a Bright Glass Gearhulk as the artifact in target for this aura to remove something. The Ward 1 is so much worse. It's half as good as Ward 2. It's fine-ish, but it isn't as taxing as nearly as taxing as Sheltered by Ghosts. There have been plenty of times when I'm playing an aggressive deck, and I think that I'm playing against Dimir midrange, and even if my opponent has nothing on the battlefield, sometimes I just go, hey, I'm gonna cast the Sheltered by Ghosts because I need this thing to stay alive. And Ward 1, much more easy to navigate around than Ward 2. I think outside of the Bright Glass Gearhulk stuff, I think for the most part, this card isn't as good as another card that's in standard, Duskrose Reliquary. You have to work. The fact that this only enchants artifacts means that there are going to be a non-zero number of times where you're playing, you have this in hand, and you just can't find an artifact for this. You can argue, okay, like I'm playing like Celestia Cage, which is doing the Bright Glass Gearhulk stuff, and also has Collector's Cage, which itself is an artifact that you can put this on. All the same things are being a tutor target, being removal, being something that you can cash in a cage that has already, you've already cast the card with Hideaway that was under the cage. All those things are answered by Duskrose Reliquary, and Duskrose Reliquary hits both. I believe it hits both creatures and artifacts. And you don't have the problem of a 2-for-1 with Duskrose Reliquary, where if they can kill the thing that it is enchanted to, they get their creature back. So this card I think is fine. I think that it is playable in those Celestia Cage style lists, but I'm not sure how much better it is than Duskrose Reliquary. Next is Lightstall Inquisitor. For a single white, we have a creature Angel Wizard at rare. It is a 2/1 with Vigilance. When this creature enters, each opponent exiles a card from their hand and may play that card for as long as it remains exiled. Each spell cast this way costs 1 generic more to cast. Each land played this way enters tapped. I think this card is very good, but I do want to talk about this card. I'm going to be talking about it a lot in a way where it sounds like I don't think that this card's very good. So let's just get it out of the way. I think that this card is very good, but I think that you need to be in an aggressive strategy to play this card. There have been some talks from folks in Discords that I'm in, or some talks online about Lightstall Inquisitor kind of being a replacement-ish for Hopeless Nightmare, as a 1-drop that quote-unquote discards a card from your opponent that you can pick up with a Pixie or a Kieran or whatever to repeat. To me, that game plan doesn't really work. Lightstall Inquisitor is a creature, so in order for it to get, sure, it theoretically also does 2 damage at some point, which Hopeless Nightmare did, because this is a 2/1, and you know, if your opponent can't block this, then this is going to do much more damage to your opponent than a Hopeless Nightmare would for less mana. Certainly a Hopeless Nightmare ends up doing a lot of damage, but you have to pay 1 mana each time for it to do so. The big issue is if your opponent is able to put anything in front of this, then you're not able to get the damage in. If you aren't playing this and beating your opponent down, then this sort of exile-based discard that just sort of adds a little tax to whatever is going on is significantly worse than forcing them to discard. You can argue that, okay, given the prevalence of reanimator strategies in Standard right now, forcing an actual discard, it can be worse, but because then you're letting your opponent put in their like reanimation target into the graveyard without having to go through any hoops on their end. To me, they're already 90% of the time they've built their deck in a way that they have a way to put that card into the graveyard already. So you're not doing a ton differently in there when you're playing like a Hopeless Nightmare and they dump like a Valgavoth. Okay, it's a feel bad moment, but it's not the end of the world. The more important thing is, if you think about how sort of a discard or a Pixie deck works, is they're wanting to strip your hand, and then they're wanting to kill you before you can, because it's really a super powered discard deck. You're wanting to strip your opponent of their opening 7, which is the most important cards that they drew in the game 90% of the time, and hope that they can kill you before you can get to a point where you rip an answer off the top of your deck. When you're doing like Hopeless Nightmare or even like Bandit's Talent type stuff, like the even more hardcore versions of discard decks, the top of your opponent's deck is a big enemy, but if your opponent rips a land off the top of their deck, then you know it's not the end of the world, right? It's often exactly what you want, because often all they can do is either just hold it because they're wanting to avoid getting hurt by the Bandit's Talent, or if they don't affect the board in any way, even if they played it. If they rip a land off the top and you're stripping their hand with a Lightstall Inquisitor by pixing it over and over and over again, that just means they regain access to these cards that you put a tax on. So even your opponent ripping lands off the top of their deck after it's been stripped with a Lightstall Inquisitor means that the work that you did with the Lightstall Inquisitor wasn't really enough to get the job done. Other important part comparing Lightstall Inquisitor to Hopeless Nightmare, you can't really do like I'm gonna hold up a Nowhere to Run plus a Kieran with a Lightstall Inquisitor. Like you literally can, but if you do it that way, you're slowing down your clock because your opponent is not going to take the damage from the Lightstall Inquisitor's attack. You have to choose between damage to them and making them discard cards or making them pseudo discard cards from their hand, because your Lightstall Inquisitor is going to have summoning sickness if you ended up picking it up. So you're kind of forced to mostly use things like Pixie or Fear of Isolation, these sorcery speed bounce effects, rather than your Sun Pearl Kirans and your Ambrosias. If you're trying to apply the pressure that I think that you would need if you're for a, Pixie style version of a Lightstall Inquisitor deck. Finally, especially in like Esper Pixie, Lightstall Inquisitor is a creature. It's not a non-creature. So a lot of the times a Esper Pixie list would be picking up these Hopeless Nightmares, recasting these Hopeless Nightmares, triggering prowess on a bunch of these prowess otters that they generated from their Storm Chasers talents, and be able to close the game very quickly there. Lightstall Inquisitor is not going to trigger prowess, so again, these a Pixie deck with Lightstall Inquisitor is going to be, I think, too slow to get the job done. For trying to use this as, hey, here's the new Hopeless Nightmare. Again, I said at the beginning when I talked about this card, it's going to sound like I don't think that this card's good. I think that this card's very good, but I think that it's mostly good in White Weenie or Boros aggressive strategies, where being a Savannah Lion with Vigilance and putting your opponent, destabilizing your opponent just enough is good enough to get the job done. Other thing to note is, interestingly, this is an angel. We do have Giada in Foundations. We do have things like Resplendent Angel in LCI. So if there is any sort of angel strategy going on, here's a 1-drop angel. This might be important in Pioneer. I'm not totally sure it's that important in Pioneer, because most of the angel decks in Pioneer are Selesnya angels doing Collective Company stuff, and you're wanting more 3-drops than you're wanting 1-drops. You're really only playing like Speaker of the Heavens, and I don't even know how many are still playing cards like Speaker of the Heavens. But you do have there's also Youthful Valkyrie in Foundations as well, which this works well with. So maybe there is a more aggressively slanted angel deck that you can go in with Lightstall Inquisitor. If I'm going to build a deck with this, I'm going to put it in as an aggressive 1-drop in a White Weenie style strategy. Bunch of Savannah Lions, some way to mass pump them, get in and go. Probably play this with the Cosmogrand Zenith as well. Speaking of white aggressive strategies, Lumen class frigate. For 1 and a white, we have an artifact spacecraft at rare. It's a spacecraft, so it has station. At 12 plus charge counters, this turns into a flying lifelink 3/5. I think the only thing that matters on this card is at 2 charge counters, it is an anthem for all of your creatures. So you curve a Savannah Lion into a Lumen class frigate. Sure, you lose the 2 damage on turn 2, but even if I say you lose, if you're playing something like the Lightstall Inquisitor that had Vigilance, then you don't even lose the 2 damage. You attack, and then on your second main, tap it for station. And then you can just go to town. You either play a War Leader's Call on turn 3, or you double spell on turn 3 with a 2-drop and a 1-drop, and just start smashing in. There is in Foundations, there's already a card called Anthem of Champions, which is for a green and a white. Other creatures creatures you control get +1/+1. So there is the makings of a very aggressive, like mostly 1-drop, White Weenie or Selesnya Weenie style strategy. That's not just like the Rabbits deck out there. And I think Lumen Class Frigate would fit into there. There's really no world where I ever see you getting to 12 charge counters on this. It's there, so the game goes long enough. You do have this as an option. Your creatures getting +1/+1 mean that they're going to be able to turn this on, station this up faster. If there's some sort of board stall thing going on, keep in mind, if there's a board stall thing going on, you're tapping your creatures at sorcery speed, so your opponent can just start swinging in. But it is there in the rare scenarios where you could use it. It would be turning it into a creature, so it would suddenly leave it vulnerable to creature-based removal, but that is an option. I mostly see this as a 2-mana Anthem for like a White Weenie deck. We already talked about Pinnacle Starcage when we were talking about Beyond the Quiet, so I'm going to go ahead and move on beyond that. This is a card that I think is underhyped for the current set. Scout for Survivors. For 2 and a white, we have a sorcery at uncommon. Return up to 3 target creature cards with total mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. Put a +1/+1 counter on each of them. So we already have things like Helping Hand and things like Lively Dirge in Standard. We also have things like Phoenix Down in Standard. And then we obviously also have Raise the Past. Where I think Scout the Survivors fits in is if you want to be... Where I think Raise the Past works is if you're trying to specifically like combo kill your opponent. You're trying to do Emalia stuff with Starscape Clerics and a ton of sack outlets, stuff like that, and like no 3-drops and above. Then that's where you and playing things like Snarling Gorehound, then that's where a Raise the Past is super powerful, because you get this mass reanimation for 4 mana as long as you build your deck in a certain way. Scout for Survivors is much more there for if you are trying to play like Halia, or if you're trying to play Sephiroth, if you're trying to play Zoraline, you're trying to play these very powerful 3-drops in these Orzhov colors, but still want the ability to, bring back a 3, Infestation Sages, or a Nesting Bot and a Voice of Victory. You still want the ability to recur things from your graveyard, or get back a Sephiroth that your opponent dealt with. You still want to have that option available to you, while still having a slightly weaker version of this reanimation, of a Raise the Past reanimation. And the fact that you have both Scout for Survivors and Lively Dirge means that you aren't just relying on one of them to do this this reanimation. So I think I want to try and build a more mid-rangey version of that sacrifice list rather than the raise the pass all 2 drops and less version. I do think that the raise the pass version will get there when we start talking about some other cards as we go on down. I think that the raise the pass version is also getting a lot of help in this set. So the mid-rangey version still might just be the worst way to go, but this is a pretty powerful effect. And I haven't even really talked about putting the +1/+1 counters on each of them, meaning that the things that you're getting back are just better than they were before. So, card that I think is overlooked that I think will see some play. Card that I don't think is getting overlooked but is great is Seam Rip. For a single white, we have an enchantment at uncommon. When this enchantment enters, exile target non-land permanent that opponent controls with mana value 2 or less until this enchantment leaves the battlefield. So with rotation, you're losing lay down arms, and so your 1 mana white removal, 1 lay down arms is very specifically for your mono white or mostly white control decks, but you didn't really have much else at 1 other than like Elspeth Smite, which is a fine card. The original printing is rotating, but they did reprint it in Foundations, so it's going to technically still be in Standard, so don't worry about that. So you would still have Elspeth Smite, but it's essentially a functional reprint of a card called Portable Hole, which is a card that has seen Pioneer play, used to see Modern play. I think it's been overtaken at this point by other cards, but a very powerful removal spell that hits a lot of the things that you actually care about. Important things to note: Pinnacle Starcage doesn't hit enchantments, which is important for 2 ways. One, that means if your opponent has like an Innkeeper's Talent or an Insidious Roots or Proth's Eidetic Memory on the battlefield, then your Pinnacle Starcage will not remove that. 2, but Seam Rip would be able to remove that. 2, because Seam Rip is an enchantment, you can play both Seam Rip and Pinnacle Starcage in the same deck and not have to worry about them, clashing with each other like Pinnacle Starcage and Ultimate do. You can remove their I don't even know what like a good. You can remove their Optimistic Scavenger. I always have to think of the name of that card. You can remove their Optimistic Scavenger on turn 1. They play a couple of 2 drops over the next 2 turns, and then be completely fine playing a Pinnacle Starcage and not have to worry about the Optimistic Scavenger popping back out for there. So I think this card is going to be a pretty heavy staple in a lot of control decks, a lot of mid-range decks. This card's great. Not much else to say about it. I think it's just going to be widely played. The Ceramia. And the Ceramia. No. Cerima. The Cerima. For 1 white, we have a legendary artifact, Spacecraft at rare. When this enters, search your library for a legendary creature card, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle. It has Station. It takes 7 charge counters to turn this into a creature. And then when it is a creature, other tapped legendaries you control have Indestructible. I think this card is just... This is pretty borderline on a card that I would want to talk about. I think it's mostly interesting for like your Serapharen, Selesnya, or Naya Legends lists. Maybe even like your like Naya Annie joins up style lists. Those lists are losing a lot with the rotation of Plaza of Heroes, so it's going to be a lot more difficult to put together the right mana base for it. But if you can get away with like just a pure Selesnya Legends, then this being able to tutor something up is great. And then obviously giving all of your other legends indestructible, which is both important for, you know, when you're attacking, and for those legends that you had to use to station up the Sarima, because those are also tapped and therefore would then have indestructible. I don't know if it's 100% like this card and the way that this card is designed is why you can only station as a sorcery. If you could station as an instant, this card would be very, very disgusting in the right deck. But is it really, like, if that is true, is it really worth it to make a mechanic that I think is very, very weak just so you can have this sort of this effect? I don't know. Mostly this is here as it itself being a legend, and as a way to tutor up other legends. And like I said, this is pretty borderline on something I wanted to talk about. And I think that is our last white card. It is. So go ahead and bring this down real quick. I'll pull up the next colors. We're going to be moving to blue next. And blue is Slim Pickens. Only have 3 cards to talk about with blue, though one of them is one of, I think, the better cards in the set. First up is Cerebral Download. For 4 and a blue, we have an instant at uncommon. It has Surveil X, where X is the number of artifacts you control, then draw 3 cards. 5 mana, draw 3. It's just sort of like your Jace's Ingenuity. Instant speed is nice. I don't really know if they had one. I don't remember if Jace's Ingenuity was instant speed or not, but I don't know how often they give 5 mana, draw 3 at instant speed. But I think these days that's probably not good enough. What I do think is that this is a decent card for the aforementioned synthesizer list. If you have any artifact synergy, which synthesizer will have, this kind of can act as a replacement for your I think it was called Kayla's invention. It's the X white spell that looked at the top 7. You put X number of artifacts or enchantments with mana value 3 or less from among them onto the battlefield. Here you have a number of artifacts on the battlefield. You get to surveil, sculpt the top of your deck so that you can find your synthesizer, or you can find your perilous snare or whatever have you. Obviously, it's not putting them directly onto the battlefield, but being able to hold up mana means maybe you can play a little bit more of a controlling game with Cerebral Download. Maybe this is a sideboard card. You bring this in alongside like some No More Lises or some 3 steps ahead in your sideboard game if you want to be a little bit more controlling against your opponent, and have this as sort of your big card draw spell to reload, find your answers, find your synthesizers. I don't really think that there's a ton of other decks that would play this effect. Again, I don't think that if you aren't getting some amount of surveil on top of this, I'm not sure that this is that playable, but I do think that this has potential in artifacts. Next is Consult the Star Charts. For 1 in a blue, we have an instant at rare. It has Kicker for 1 in a blue. And it says, look at the top X cards of your library, where X is the number of lands you control. Put 1 of those cards into your hand. If the spell was kicked, put 2 of those cards into your hand instead. Put the rest in the bottom of your library in a random order. I think that this card, in traditional control, or even in like ramp, is kind of nutty. If you're casting, if you're casting this on curve, an instant speed sleight of hand, that's not really good enough for 2 mana. It's fine. People have played Dreams of Laguna in standard, in your sort of traditional control list, but it's, you can replace this card with any other number of cards, and they all kind of do very similar things. Your Deduces, your Dreams of Laguna, and then your Consult the Star Charts. And then if you kick it, it's, you probably have 4 lands on the battlefield if you're kicking it, so it's going to be very similar to like a lot of versions of 4 mana draw 2s that have been in the past. I think it was called like Behold the Multiverse or something like that, from Kaldheim. 4 mana, Surveil 2, Draw 2, stuff like that. Very similar to things like that. Where this card gets nutty is the longer the game goes on, because it gets closer and closer to Demonic Tutor as the game goes on long. It gets closer and closer to Dig Through Time, or whatever the card is. There's the 4 mana card from I think back in Ikoria, or maybe even like M20, Memory Deluge, that's what it was called. It gets closer and closer to that, and even starts getting better than something like that as the game gets longer and longer and you are making more and more land drops. Being able to search through this, dig super deep into your deck and find the exact card, often the exact card that you need for a particular scenario, is great. You do need to be playing a deck that expects to have a lot of lands in play. So a traditional control list, a ramp strategy, especially one like playing with Overlord of the Hauntwoods that are creating land tokens so that you're getting a lot more lands on the battlefield. So then this really starts looking like a Demonic Tutor. I think that this card is one of the best cards in the set. Finally, we got Scour for Scrap for 3 and a blue. We have an instant at uncommon. It It says choose one or both. Search your library for an artifact card, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle, or return target artifact card from your graveyard to your hand. This is another card that I think really only fits in Selesnya, or sorry, not Selesnya, Azorius Synthesizer, your Synthesizer style decks, your Azorius Battlefront style decks. Kind of does very similar things to the other card that we just talked about, the 5-mana draw 3 that we just talked about, but is more here for a literal tutor for your Simulacrum Synthesizer, and also is a way to recur synthesizers that got blown up by your opponent. Mostly see this as a sideboard card rather than a main deck card. I wouldn't really expect anyone to play this in best of one, putting this into the main deck, but if your opponent is playing Ultimas, or if they have a decent amount of artifact removal, then I could see you bringing in this from the sideboard. Like I said, blue is pretty slim pickings, so we already are done with blue. So I'm going to go ahead and bring this down and move on to black. And I think black is one of the better cards, or one of the better colors coming out of the set. We have, let me see if I can count. Not 36. I have, no, sorry, that's review. Okay. Sorry. I need to look in one deeper. I have 7 items that we're going to talk about out of black. We are going to start with Arch Enemy's Charm. So for black, we get an instant at rare. It says choose one, exile target creature or planeswalker, or return 1 or 2 target creature and or planeswalker cards from your graveyard to your hand, or put 2 +1/+1 counters on target creature you control. It gains lifelink until end of turn. Being triple black really means that this can only exist in mono black, but I think that this card is super powerful and is a pretty good reason to want to be in mono black for your like mono black mid-range lists. Two of these options are basically the same things that were on Gix's command, which is rotating out, and then just sort of unconditional creature and planeswalker removal is fantastic. Being able to answer your opponent's Kaidos, being able to answer whatever your opponent throws at you. You're dealing with things like Unstoppable Slasher in black, which becomes significantly harder to kill with Go for the Throat rotating, because Shoot the Sheriff does not kill Unstoppable Slasher as it is an assassin. Being able to recur 2 creatures from your side if you are in some sort of mid-range mirror, as sort of 2-for-1ing, 2-for-1 card advantage. And then this letting you get a little bit of life also synergizes pretty well with Demon Wall, to be able to turn that into a creature sort of ahead of schedule and start actually beating down with it instead of just it being there to help you trigger your Unholy Annex. I think this card's pretty great. The only thing that I would say with respect to this card is it becomes a lot more difficult to play that many copies of Soulstone Sanctuary if you want to play Arch Enemy's Charm. because triple black is pretty difficult to cast if you have like 4 Soulstone Sanctuaries, or even worse if you're playing even more lands that don't tap for black. You're playing Fountain Ports, or you're playing Demolition Fields, or what have you. So you will have to, if you do decide to play this card, even if you currently are playing like a black Demons deck, you still will have to consider your mana base a little bit, rather than just jamming this into your deck. So keep that in mind. Scrounge for Eternity. I think this is a card that some people have overlooked. For 2 and a black, we get a sorcery at uncommon. It has, as an additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice an artifact or creature. Return target creature or spacecraft with mana value 5 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield, then create a lander token. I went and did a Scryfall search when I first saw this card. I think the best thing to do with this is in some sort of Grixis mid-range list, or mostly Rakdos mid-range list with Kefka, where you're playing things like Fear of Missing Out, or you're playing things like there's a card called Sahili's Lattice from LCI, which is an artifact that Tormenting Voices. There's also another one of those in this set that we'll get to when we talk about red. To dump a Kefka into the graveyard and then get it onto the battlefield on turn 3, way ahead of schedule, and just really start applying the pressure pretty quickly. The other cool thing to note about this is if you do it once, if you're able to Scrounge for Eternity once, it fuels the second cast of Scrounge for Eternity. So sure, if your opponent goes, if you go, okay, I Fear of Missing Out, put a Kefka into the graveyard, next turn, attack with my Fear of Missing Out, then cast Scrounge for Eternity, put sacrifice Fear of Missing Out to bring back Kefka, and then my opponent has removal for Kefka. This created a lander token by it resolving, so if you have another Scrounge for Eternity, you can just sacrifice the lander token to get Kefka back again, which is really what I think makes this from kind of a clunky reanimation spell where it's like, okay, maybe just wait one turn and just do zombify stuff, and then if you're doing zombify stuff, then go bigger than Kefka, to a card that I think is reasonable to try and play for a slightly less, you can even argue about how less powerful Kefka is. Kefka is a pretty darn powerful card, but not this sort of like huge, immediate game-ending threat that you're getting back with something like a Zombify, but being able to chain these things off, and then, if you really want to later, cash in the lander token to go find mana so that you can just start casting your Kefkas ahead of schedule. So yeah, Bound for Eternity, I think a sleeper card in the set. Sasurian Voidborn. For 2 and a black, we have a creature Vampire Soldier at uncommon. It's a 2/2 with whenever this creature or another creature or artifact you control dies, target opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life, and it has a warp of a single black. If if this didn't have warp, I wouldn't really talk about this. It's really like basically Albed scavengers from the Final Fantasy set, which didn't see a ton of play. But the fact that this does have warp means that you rip this off the top, you can just, you know, go for kind of a combo-ish turn by sneaking this in plus playing some other stuff and trying to deal a ton of damage through your sort of sack outlet combo with it. You would have to play this in the more mid-rangey versions because it's not going to be something that gets brought back with Raise the Pass, but it's I mostly just wanted to talk about this is an interesting option for those decks because you can warp it in for a single black. So yeah. Sassurian Voidboy. Another one of the best cards in the set, and could be a sign to try and to be in black as the best aggressive color in the format going forward after the sort of decimation of red with all the bans and then rotation. Timeline color for black. We have a creature Drix Warlock. Warlock is important as it is a outlaw and therefore can't be hit by Shoot the Sheriff. It is an uncommon at 2/2, so a 2-mana 2/2 with haste. You may cast this card from your graveyard using its warp ability, and then it has its warp ability is for a single black and pay 2 life. So turn 1, you could pay 1 and 2 life to warp this out of your hand, hit your opponent for 2, goes into the warp zone. Turn 2, you play this from the warp zone. It has haste, hits your opponent for 2. They kill it. Turn 3, you play another one of these from your hand and cast this from the graveyard for a single black and 2 more life. Smack your opponent for another 2. Very difficult for your opponent to deal with. They have to find some way to exile it or play explicit graveyard hate to deal with this card. And they can't, because you're casting it from your graveyard, they can't it's not like they can respond to you casting it like something like I believe this is how it would work. It's unlike zombifying something. You can't I'm gonna make my opponent spend their mana to cast a zombify and then I eat their target. If you let them get to a point where they can play something at sorcery speed, then they can just cast this and it's already onto the stack, not actually in the graveyard anymore, and you're unable to eat it. I believe that's how it works. We'll have to see when we get to the actual release of the card, but I believe that's how it actually works. I believe that's similar to what happens with a Gravecrawler. You have to actually hit the Gravecrawler before they're given the opportunity to cast the Gravecrawler. Other important thing with here is that this is a way to deal damage to yourself. So this alongside Cecil means that you are very quickly getting to a point where you can flip Cecil over. More damage to yourself means maybe Last Ride memes actually exist, because you're going to have things like this. You're going to have Shocklands in Standard, which we'll get to when we go on later. You can pretty quickly get yourself down to a low enough life total to both have Last Ride be actually able to attack, and probably more importantly, be able to flip Cecil, turn it into a 4/4 for that only cost you 1 black mana to start with. I think a curve of Cecil into this, or this into this, plus something like Unstoppable Slasher, or I haven't really, or maybe if you go Rakdos, you can go Screaming Nemesis, or whatever, the legendary creature that lets you discard 2 and draw 2. Pretty good aggro deck out there. I'm gonna try and build mono black aggro, this, Dark Confidants, Cecils, and just try and smash as my aggressive strategy going into Edge of Eternities. So keep this card in mind. I think it's one of the best cards in the set. Tragic Trajectory is our next one up. For a single black, we have a sorcery at uncommon. Target creature gets -2/-2 until end of turn, and then Void. That creature gets -10/-10 until end of turn. Instead, if a non-land permanent left the battlefield this turn, or a spell was warped this turn. I think a lot of the time this card is just going to be sorcery speed stab, which stab is in Foundations at instant speed, and if you're fine with it just being -2/-2, play stab. There's the huge upside of, if you can trigger Void, then this basically kills anything out there that reasonably sees play in Standard. The problem is, I think Void is much harder to handle than, or to deal with, than something like Revolt. Even in Standard, where we don't have that many fetch lands, we would have had some number of fetch lands, and so you would have been able to play this alongside those fetch lands to more easily get the reason that you would play this spell. The other thing is, sure, you can like go into creature combat and like attack and hope that they block so that the creature dies or something like that, but I think outside of like the first week or so of Standard, that's going to be pretty easily telegraphed as to, oh, they're making this attack because they have a Tragic Trajectory in hand. I'll just take the damage, or whatever, right? Rather than have my Beza get shot by a Tragic Trajectory. The fact that this is sorcery means that it doesn't really work with, it doesn't even really work with things like Mobilize. So you can't like mobilize, let your mobilized creatures die from sacrificing it, and then Tragic Trajectory, because you're already in your end step, you can't play sorcery speed stuff. I think it's fine in, again, your mono black aggro, your Cecil, the card that we just saw, that type of stuff, where your opponent eventually is going to have to try to block stuff, at which point you can, you're not playing that many lands, so playing something like a Tragic Trajectory is good in those decks, because you'll be able to trigger Void much more often there. I don't really think that the game plan of I'm going to like shoot the Sheriff one thing and then Tragic Trajectory another thing is that realistic. because often you'll just have Tragic Trajectory in hand, and then they're just beating you down with this thing that doesn't get killed by Tragic Trajectory, and you're like, just you wait till I draw another card so I can turn this card into an actual playable card for this scenario. So yeah, I think you really have to either be aggressive or be in a sacrifice strategy where you are almost guaranteed to be able to hit void at your leisure on your turn. So yeah, it's a good card. I wouldn't just jam it into any old black mid-range list. I think that you need to be aggressive, playing cards that have void, or being aggressive enough that your opponent has to start chump blocking or blocking your things that are coming in, even if they can telegraph the fact that you have a Tragic Trajectory. Or playing in sacrifice where you're going to be able to hit void at your own leisure. But yeah, Tragic Trajectory. Not the second coming of Fatal Push. Possibly the best card in the set. Umbral Collar Zealot for 1 and a black. Creature Human Cleric at uncommon. It is a 3/2 for 2 that says sacrifice another creature or artifact, surveil 1. They didn't give us unbounded instant speed sack outlets for years. And then we got Bartolome, and now this. I think this is, I shouldn't say significantly better than Bartolome. This card is insane in your Orzhov Raise the Past lists because this surveils. So you can just, like, the whole reason that you're playing cards like Snarling Gorehound in your Orzhov Raise the Past is you just want to dump cards into the graveyard and find your Raise the Past. Here's another way that is also part of your sack outlet, which you need in most of those decks, to dump creatures into your graveyard and find your Raise the Past. This card, and it's a 3/2, so even if, like, you don't really quite have your sacrifice engine going on, this can still just attack and deal pretty significant chunks of damage. This is an insane card. Really only fits in one archetype, but is so good for that archetype. We got one more card left. 0 Point Ballad for X and black. You have a sorcery at rare. Destroy all creatures with toughness X or less. You lose X life. If X is 6 or more, return a creature card put into a graveyard this way to the battlefield under your control. I think this card is fine in like Dimir control or Esper control. Probably Dimir. If you're going to go Esper, then you've got access to the White Sweepers, and I think those are in general better than 0 Point Ballad. Where I think that this gets awkward is, like, this is fine in against an aggressive strategy, right? It in order to essentially do the same thing that like your choking miasma or your like 3 mana sorcery speed black small sweeper. Everything gets -2/-2. You pay 3 mana into the 0-point ballad, you're going to kill everything that has 2 toughness in the same way that those work. Here you're going to have to pay 2 life in order to do so, but you know, you do have the flexibility of this sweeping bigger things or sweeping smaller things for cheaper. The problem that I think that's going to happen is if you get to the point where you're having to actually use this to sweep a big board, that's a lot of life loss that you're taking. If you already sort of like have a relatively stable board, then the life loss is not terrible. But there's going to be points where you literally just can't cast this because it would kill you. I think that's a non-zero amount. And the whole return a creature that was put into the graveyard on the battlefield this way, I don't really think that that's realistic. A realistic thing to happen that often. 7 mana for something like this. Maybe it happens every once in a blue moon. But even if it does, how often is that going to be like absolutely game winning? I don't know. I mostly see this as a choking miasma that you can be fine with playing main deck, but you really have to start worrying if you have to actually cast this as a big creature sweeper. Like, there's no world where you're going to be able to use this to deal with like a reanimated Bahamut or something like that. The other thing is, I don't know how much better this card is than the Black Sun Zenith that was attached to the 4-drop Black Dragon that had Ward discard a card. Costs 1 more black mana to start with, so gonna be a little bit more expensive to deal with your smaller things. It's gonna be 4 to deal with -2/-2 instead of 3, but you keep getting that reshuffled in. That is also a win condition that you can start beating down with if you've gotten to the point where you've cleared the board and it's not going to hurt you. So if you do have to cast it for a fairly high amount, you're totally fine there. So those are the 2 things I wanted to talk about with the 0-point ballad. I think it's a fine card. I don't think it's gonna become like a staple or like turn Dimir control into the thing that you want to do rather than Azorius control. There might be another reason why you'd want to play Dimir control, which we'll get to when we talk about the lands rather than Azorius control, but we'll go on from there. So that is the end of black. So let's go ahead and close that down and move on to red. We have 7 cards to look at in red as well. And we're going to start with a pretty good one. Full Bore. For a single red, we have an instant and uncommon. Target creature you control gets +3/+2 until end of turn. If that creature was cast for its warp cost, it also gains trample and haste until end of turn. As just an infuriate, this might see some play in your fling decks. I don't know how viable fling is. I talked about why I think fling is going to be much less viable when we talked about rotation because of the loss of Cacophony Scamp and Monastery Swift Spear. But still, it is a one mana pump spell that gives +3, which is important for those fling decks. Really, the thing that is interesting for this card is playing creatures for their warp cost and making them be able to actually get in on the turn that you play them for their warp cost. Every warp cost is, well, I shouldn't say every, there's one where it's not, but everything but one warp cost is less than the mana cost of the creature spell, and often it is significantly less than, and the power and toughness of the creature doesn't really get affected by its warp cost. So if there is some sort of like warp haste strategy going on, then Full Bore is absolutely a linchpin for that type of a deck, so that you can get in these big hits way earlier than expected against your opponent and just put them off their game very, very quickly. Nova Hellkite. For 3 red, we have a creature dragon at rare. It is a 4/5 with flying and haste, and when this creature enters, it deals 1 damage to target creature and opponent controls, and then it also has warp for 2 and a red. This card is pretty pushed for a warp card. This is like the Full Bore stuff, this is like the prototypical Full Bore thing, and you don't even have to have Full Bore to get the swing in, because it itself is coming in with haste already. And then the like deal 1 damage to target creature and opponent controls, often that's not going to be that relevant, but like in the scenarios where it is relevant, it is a blowout. If you kill their Llanowar Elves with your Nova Hellkite, if you kill their Lightstall Inquisitor with a Nova Hellkite, you kill some X1 with the Nova Hellkite, that is often just the game. Especially if you did it on the warp cost, and the fact that warp isn't like Evoke in that, okay, I did this the first time and then it goes away forever. No, you just get to go turn 3 play this, turn 4 play something else, turn 5 play this again, and now it's here for good. This card is cracked. Not quite the best card in the set, but I think pretty easily the best card in red, and the most straightforward card in red. You don't even have to think too hard about why this card is powerful. Next up is Plasma Bolt. For a single red, we have a sorcery at common. Plasma Bolt deals 2 damage to any target, and then if you can trigger Void, it deals 3 damage instead to any target. I think that this card is worse than Initial Impressions. This is one of the cards where I'm putting it out there that I'm not sure how playable this actually is, because it kind of has the same scenarios as Tragic Trajectory, where I'm not really sure how valuable being able to go, shoot something and to blow something else up, trigger Void by using like a removal spell or something in order to turn this on, to turn it into a literal a lava spike, right? 1 mana sorcery speed, deal 3 damage to your opponent's face, which is really where you would often want to be doing a plasma bolt toward like if you're trying to just do like a 1 mana deal 3 as like creature removal, Torch the Tower is already there and it's often better. You could argue that things like Torch the Tower or things like Bargain are good for Void, but you're still like the weird thing here, especially with Plasma Bolt, is you kind of think, okay, I really want to play this in like an aggressive red deck that's using burn against my opponent's face, but I then had to use burn against my opponent's creature in order to then Plasma Bolt. Like it doesn't really work that well with something like a Slick Shot Show Off because it's sorcery speed, so again, you can't even like really make the argument here of like, okay, well, I attack and like maybe my opponent has to chump my ground creature, and so then I then have a Plasma Bolt that can go to their face, but then that doesn't trigger your Slick Shot Show Off for its actual attack. So if I wanted to actually use this with a Slick Shot Show Off, I would have had to have already used removal against my opponent's creature, or my opponent would have had to have used removal against something of my own. Like maybe that's the argument. Like Plasma Bolt is, hey, if my opponent is shooting my things, then I can Plasma Bolt them. But then if that like becomes a prevalent strategy, then your opponent can just try and use their removal at sorcery speed themselves. Because Plasma Bolt is sorcery speed, you won't be able to get the advantage of the Void effect. Really, for Plasma Bolt, you're really gonna have to play it alongside Nova Hellkite. You really have to be doing the warps stuff to get the Void trigger, rather than the non-land permanents leaving the battlefield. So I could see in like a Nova Hellkite version of your aggressive strategy, maybe you can play Plasma Bolt there. You go Nova Hellkite Warp on turn 4 and then Plasma Bolt their face as well. But I think for the most part, this is kind of on board on the same level as just Shock. Sorcery speed versus instant speed. The instant speed, I think, might be worth the 1 damage and additional hoops you have to jump through in order to access that 1 damage. So that's really why I want to talk about this card. I think it's worse than you think. Ruinous Rampage for 1 red. We have a sorcery at uncommon. It has choose 1. Ruinous Rampage deals 3 damage to each opponent, and then or exile all artifacts with mana value 3 or less. Really only 2 reasons I want to talk about this card. Brotherhood's End is rotating, and Brotherhood's End is one of the ways that non-white decks, red decks that didn't have white, could handle a synthesizer list. And if you were playing Brotherhood's End in your sideboard for the synthesizer matchup, then Ruinous Rampage is there. Other thing to note is that this is not like in the same way that Abrade and Suplex were kind of the same card. This is not the kind of the same card for Brotherhood's End, because the damage thing is only to your opponent's face. It is not a sweeper. So if you had Brotherhood's End in your sideboard as both a 3-mana sweeper to deal with, you know, a go wide, convoke, or token strategy, but then you would also bring it in against synthesizer lists for it pulling double duty. I think really the only reason that you would play Ruinous Rampage is for synthesizer, and you would have to find another option for your 3-mana sweepers. I think there's like Sweltering Suns in Foundations. There is some sort of 3-mana red sweeper that exists in Standard, but you're not going to be able to. You're basically having to take Brotherhood's End, which was a card that covered 2 scenarios in the decks that would play Brotherhood's End, and replace it with two separate cards. So yeah, that's Ruinous Rampage. Next, Tanook Steadfast Second. For 2 red, we get a legendary creature, Kavu Pilot, at Mythic. It is a 3/5 that says other creatures you control have haste. Artifact cards and red creature cards in your hand have warp for 2 and a red. This is definitely a card that I want to build around. Very, very powerful effect. The giving things warp, and the fact that it also gives creatures haste means that you can kind of use this like sneak attack, like a standard power level sneak attack. You play a Tanook, you untap, you can go play a 2-drop and then also warp something in. The 2-drop has haste, the warp thing has haste. Whatever you're warping in, like a Drakaseth, a Clive, just crashing into your opponent way earlier than they expect. Just very, very powerful. Extremely powerful. 4 mana for a 3/5. Not the greatest stat line in the world, and it really isn't doing too much by itself the turn that you play it. So it might be one of those things where like it's a cool build around, but how competitive it is, I'm not so sure. But I think that this is a card where anytime, both as soon as it is spoiled, you do a Scryfall search for expensive artifacts and expensive red creatures in the that are currently in Standard or will be in Standard post rotation. And then every time that a new set comes out, if there is a red creature card or a big artifact that gets printed, remind yourself that Tanook exists. And is this something that breaks Tanook? Is this something where I can make, where I can start going wild with Tanook? So, I think it's a super sweet card. I want to try and brew around with it in Standard and see what we can do. It kind of fits like the red Kona vibes to me. Really just think of it like a sneak attack. Left Stalker Ardent. For 2 and a red, we have a creature Drix Artificer at uncommon. It is a 2/3. It says whenever another creature or artifact you control enters, this creature deals 1 damage to each opponent, and then it has warp for a single red. Very similar to the creature card that was 2 and a black, that Blood Artist. Here's a 3-drop that impacts Tremors, but also cares about artifacts. So there's a 2-drop from Kaladesh that's in my Prosper deck that that cares about artifacts entering and deals 1 damage to each opponent. As well, the same way that the Blood Artist had a cheap warp cost, this one also has a cheap warp cost. I think this is better than the Blood Artist one, because it's much more reasonable to think, okay, I go 1 mana, play this, and then either like play 2 1-drops or play a 2-drop that generates a token, something like that, and just sort of mini go off there, and then, you know, later on in the game I can just play this as an impact a slightly overcosted impact trimmers outside of my sort of combo-ish turn with the Wefstalker Ardent. I could see this play in like a Boros Mobilize or a Mardu Mobilize list. Just think this is a sneakily good card. And finally in red, Zookeeper Mechan. For 1 in a red, we have an artifact creature robot at common. It is a 1/3 that taps to add a red. And for 6 in a red, target creature you control gets +4/+0 until end of turn. Activate only as a sorcery. For the most part, you can ignore the activated ability. Really, this is here to just show that this is another 2-drop mono red mana dork. There was one in Tarkir Dragonstorm. It was a 2-drop. I don't remember the power and toughness. It might have been a 1/3 as well. Actually, I think that might have been like a 3/1. That taps for red. Now you have another one that taps for red. I know people have been trying to do big red kind of stuff. This absolutely slots into big red stuff. It is an artifact. So if you have any sort of artifact synergies in your big red stuff, you've got something going on there. I think this works well with your Tanook stuff, because you can both ramp into Tanook to get him onto the battlefield quicker, and then also means that you can more quickly double warp things out with Tanook to really start applying pressure to your opponent. Yeah. I mean, a lot of the same things that any sort of mana dork does, just this is a one that you can play in a mono red deck or a deck that doesn't touch green. So, only reason I really wanted to talk about this. That's the end of red. We're going to move on to green. Don't remember how many cards we have in green. Just 6. Talk about for green. We're going to start with Edge Rover. For a single green, we have an artifact creature, Robot Scout, at uncommon. It is a 2/2 with reach. It says when this creature dies, each player creates a lander token. I mostly want to talk about this because I want to know if this is just better than Patrick Beastie. I know Patrick Beastie is a 3/3 for 1, but you can't attack with Patrick Beastie unless you have Delirium. This itself is also an artifact creature, so it helps you hit Delirium. So your Wildfire Wicker Folks and your Fear of Missing Outs can get turned on. Your Violent Urges can get turned on. All that kind of stuff can get. If you just 4 in, 4 out Patrick Beastie for Edge Rover, it's not like you're losing access to artifact creatures. An artifact creature that really helped with Delirium. Mostly for this just gets in. This will always be able to get in. If you play this on turn 1, it'll always be able to get in on turn 2, assuming your opponent can't block, right? I've played the Delirium deck, and often, even on with a turn 1 Patrick Beastie, I'm just sort of sitting there, just like, when am I gonna actually be able to attack with this thing? This thing can't block. This can't attack. When am I gonna be able to actually get in? And just being a 1-mana 2/2 that can get in is, I think, just fine. And I would like to see if you can try and play this instead of Patrick Beastie. I think for the most part, you know, it kind of has a reminder. It kind of reminds you of something like a Goblin Guide and being an overstated cheap creature that gives some advantage to your opponent. I don't really think that lander tokens are that big of a deal to give to your opponent, because if they want access to the ramp from them, they have to spend 2 mana to get it. And if you are aggressive enough, which this card is obviously statted to be in an aggressive deck, then they're not really going to have that much time to take off to use the lander token. And if they do have enough time to take off to use the lander token, then you probably were losing that game anyways, regardless of whether you gave them the lander token or not. Also, you yourself are creating a lander token. You're probably not going to crack it, but if you have any sort of synergy with sacrificing an artifact to cast a spell, or doing some sort of damage, something that cares about the number of artifacts that you have on the battlefield, then you're the one who built the deck with the Edge Rover in it, so you can take advantage of the fact that you got a lander token. So I think this card's pretty good. And I would like to see if this is just as good or better than Patrick Beastie in your lists. Frenzied Baloth for 2 green. You get a creature beast at rare. It is a 3/2 with can't be countered, has trample haste. Creature spells you control can't be countered, and combat damage can't be prevented. I think for the most part, in standard, that last line of text is irrelevant. It's really just to remind you of Questing Beast when you look at this card. For the most part, you just need to look at this as an uncounterable 2-mana 3/2 trample haste, which is a pretty good stat line. It compares... You can compare it with Wildfire Wickerfolk, which is in the Delirium lists, which is green and red for a 3/2 trample haste. Does it have trample by itself? Yeah, I think it is a 3/2 trample haste. And then with Delirium, it turns into a 4/3. Here can't be countered can be relevant. If you're going up against a control list and they have mostly stabilized the board and they're holding up their counter spells, you can sneak in a Frenzied Baloth without having to worry about it. I think, given that Cavern of Souls is in standard, a lot of the time Cavern of Souls does that job better than having, a can't be countered creature does. But it is relevant for some amount of the time. I talked about Edge Rover in relation to Gruul Delirium. I think that there's also sort of a more traditional mono green aggro list with things like Edge Rover into Frenzied Baloth, into like Surak, or even Sentinel the Nameless City on turn 3. That you could go with, whether or not that it's better than just doing the sort of Tifa landfall stuff that currently mono green is doing fairly well with post bans. That'll be a debate that can be answered when we get to the actual release and let things play out. But you do have an option for just fairly traditional mono green aggro with Frenzied Baloth. Next is Gene Pollinator. For a single green, we have an artifact creature robot insect at common. It is a 1/2 with tap, and then tap an untapped permanent you control. Add 1 mana of any color. So currently in standard, we have the gold standard of Llanowar Elves as a 1-drop mana dork. But then we also have things like Molt Tender, which sees play in Insidious Roots lists, because you, as part of being able to add mana of any color, you can you have to exile something from your graveyard, which would trigger, if you're exiling a creature, it triggers Roots. You have Sentinel Stalwart, which is tap an untapped creature you control to add 1 mana of any color. That's often pretty bad, because you can't really, even on turn 2, you really wouldn't be able to ramp something out with a Sentinel Stalwart. You have to actually have a creature, and creatures are very interactable with something like a Gene Pollinator, though, it just says tap an untapped permanent you control. So if you have map tokens lying around, if you have clue tokens lying around, if you have impending overlords lying around, you can tap all of that stuff to be able to use this as a little bit of ramp. You're not going to play this in place of Llanowar Elves, but there's an argument to play Gene Pollinator if you're looking for another 1-drop mana dork to play in some sort of ramp strategy. Next is Larval Scoutlander. For 2 and a green, we have an artifact spacecraft at uncommon. It has station. It turns into a creature at 7 charge counters and is a flying 3/3. I skipped over to that because that is almost entirely irrelevant to this card. It has an ETB of, when this spacecraft enters, you may sacrifice a land or lander. If you do, search your library for up to 2 basic land cards, put them onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. So if you have to sacrifice a land, then this is Springbloom Druid, which was printed in Foundations. It currently sees play in the aforementioned Tifa Landfall lists. You aren't really gaining too much from Marvel Scoutlander. You can argue that you're even losing something from playing Scoutlander as opposed to playing Springbloom Druid, because Springbloom Druid itself is a 1/1. You could chump block with a Springbloom Druid, and you're not really going to be able to chump block with a Larval Scoutlander unless you've already put significant time and effort into this to turn it into a creature. But if you can sacrifice a lander token, then you're taking what would have been +1 land, where you sacrifice a land to get 2 other basics. So you went down 1 to add 2. You're turning what would have been +1 land into +2 lands, which generally doesn't happen at 3 mana. You have to build around it, and there are things in standard, in this set, that generate lander tokens on turn 1 or 2. Guaranteed. We saw the Edge Rover that can technically generate a lander token early, but your opponent would have had to had that thing die in order to get it. But we might even see it in this list. There's a one drop spell that can create a lander token. There are 2-drop creatures that create lander tokens, and so if you are able to sacrifice a lander token, then this becomes very, very good. And so that's an interesting deck building puzzle to see whether or not that doing something like that for your 3 mana is better than just dealing with Springbloom Druids or playing any other 3 mana ramp spell, like a Precious Wanderings or something like that, or like an Ancient Cornucopia, or even like the Omen Cultivate that searches for basic forests. I think if you can consistently get a lander down, this is pretty powerful, being able to go from 3 to 6 instead of generally from 3 to 5 for your 3 mana ramp is pretty darn powerful. But you have to work through that deck building puzzle. Uroboroid for 2 green. We have a creature Plant Worm at Mythic. It is a 1/3 that has at the beginning of combat on your turn, put X +1/+1 counters on each creature you control, where X is this creature's power. I mostly bring this card up as if you can do like Selesnya Weenie, Selesnya Go Wide, and you don't want to be in rabbits for some reason. Even if you are in rabbits, there's an argument for something like this. This is a way to turn a wide board into also tall pretty darn quickly. Note that it puts counters onto itself, so after the first turn that you play it, you move to combat. If it wasn't removed, then this turns into a 2/4 and pumps up the rest of the board. Next turn, this would turn into a 4/6 and give 2 +1/+1 counters to the rest of the board. And so it exponentially grows the longer that it's out. Obviously, you're hoping to be done with the game by then. If it's going on that long, you probably already killed them, or you've lost the game. But it's an option at a 4-drop in some sort of Selesnya Go Wide. I think that if you're specifically in rabbits, Warren Warleader probably beats this out, even though you're not putting +1/+1 counters on the attack trigger of Warren Warleader. Warren Warleader itself is just a 4/4. So if you rip Warren Warleader off the top of the deck, then 1, Warren Warleader also is an army in the can. 2, it itself is a threat. 3, you can offspring it if you happen to have 6 mana. So if you specifically are in rabbits, I would probably just play Warren Warleader. But I could see a world where Ouroboros sees play in some sort of Selesnya Go Wide. So, we briefly mentioned it before. Sammy's Curiosity for single green. We have a sorcery at common. It says you gain 2 life, create a lander token. So if you can play this, so outside of the synergy with the larval seed ship or whatever it was called, if you can play this on turn 1, this is kind of has a rampant growth impression or a Wayfarer's Bauble impression. Is Wayfarer's Bauble in standard? I know there was that controversy with the art from LCI but it was in Commander, yeah, about somebody stealing the art for Wayfarer's Bauble, but it's from the Commander set, not in the actual regular set. So you don't have Wayfarer's Bauble. in standard. But this is basically Wayfarer's Bauble. You play it on turn 1. On turn 2, you sacrifice it for 2 mana to go search for a basic land and put it into play, tapped. Here you also get to gain a little life on it. So if you can play this on turn 1, then this is a Wayfarer's Bauble. You don't really get that too often in standard these days. You definitely don't get Rampant Growth too often. There is Glimpse the Core currently in standard, but that's specifically only for forests. If you're in any sort of deck that's trying to do more than just mono green or more than just mostly green, then you could argue for a card like this. And then also synergizing with the Spring Blue Druid that can sacrifice a lander instead of a land. This is a way to get out a lander early enough so that you can get that ramp on that super powerful ramp on turn 3. So yeah, Sammy's Curiosity. That's really the reasons to talk about this card. And I think that's the end of green. Let me just double check. Yep, that's the end of our green list. Go ahead and hide that there. Close this off. And we are on to multicoloreds. Seven multicoloreds to look at here. We're going to start with Diadrine Synthesis Amalgam. For X green and a white, we have a legendary artifact creature construct at rare. It is an 0/1 with trample, but it enters with a number of +1/+1 counters on it equal to the amount of mana spent to cast it. So it is not equal to X, it is equal with the amount of mana spent to cast it. So if X is 0, it's still going to enter in with 2 +1/+1 counters on it. So the weakest this creature can be is a 2 mana 2/3 with trample. Anything, and then any any X beyond that is just additional counters on it. So 3 total mana becomes a 3/4, 4 becomes a 4/5. Pretty decent scaling stats all along the curve. And then whenever you attack, you may remove a +1/+1 counter from each of 2 creatures you control. If you do, draw a card and create a 2/2 colorless robot artifact creature token. I think if you can find a sort of Selesnya counters or some Abzan counters, if you're able to get a bunch of counters onto things, then this is a pretty decent way to provide card advantage in a deck that often doesn't have a ton of card advantage going for it. And stat-wise along the curve is fine at really every point along the curve. Is legendary, which can be bad. If you're trying to do like go wide stuff, then it's bad in that you can't have a bunch of these on the battlefield. But being in Selesnya colors means that you can play this in a Serapharin deck and be able to flip the Serra over into Crystallized Serra, and then at that point, whether this is the thing that helps flip the Crystallized Serra over, or you draw this off the top, Crystallized Serra is going to reduce those legendary creatures by, I believe, 2 colorless. And so if you have a flipped Crystallized Serra and then you try playing a Diadrine, X can always be equal to, you can pay 2 mana and have X be equal to 2 for free. Plus it gets the static +2/+2 as a legendary creature. That's pretty powerful. So I think that it works pretty darn well, both in some sort of counters strategy, Selesnya counter strategy, and in a Selesnya Legends or Naya Legends-esque list. Next is Pinnacle Emissary, and I think this is probably the best card in the set. For 1 blue and a red, we have an artifact creature robot at rare. It is a 3/3 that has, whenever you cast an artifact spell, create a 1/1 colorless drone artifact creature token with flying, and this token can only block creatures. And then it has warp for an Izzet, so you can either pay a blue or a red to warp this in. So another of the 3 mana creatures that we have that you can warp for 1, and this is definitely the best of any of the ones that we've seen. In any sort of artifact aggro list, this triggers off of every artifact that you cast. So if you can go turn 2, warp this, play a nesting bot, get a 1/1 drone. You can go turn 3, warp this, play a nesting bot and a Magitech infantry, get 2 drones to go with it. You can get a huge board very, very quickly, both in sort of a combo turn with doing it on warp, or just having this on the battlefield. And this is not legendary, so you can have multiple of these on the battlefield and all of them see your artifacts getting cast. It's not even if that artifact enters the battlefield, you get this trigger. It's a cast trigger, so your opponent has to immediately deal with this card. Your opponent can even counter the artifact that you're casting, and you'll still get the 1/1s. They have to really deal with this card pretty quickly, or it's going to get out of hand. You need to be aggressive in this kind of deck. The tokens aren't really blocking things, aren't there to block. It can only block things with flying, but the board's going to be huge with this Pinnacle Emissary. I think really the only thing that hurts this card is the fact that VV exists, and if you're in Izzet and you want to play an Izzet 3-drop, you're gonna have to really convince yourself why you shouldn't just play VV. Why you shouldn't just play VV instead of this. But even then, there's a world where I can see you successfully arguing yourself with yourself enough to get this, to play this instead. This is an absolutely cracked card. Is powerful in the standard and powerful in older formats. Especially powerful in like really old formats with a lot of like 0-cost artifacts. Mishra's Baubles, boxes, you name it. I don't think that this is good enough to where you can be like, oh, I can play Mox Jasper now in standard, but Mox Amber, Mox Opal, the actual Power 9 Moxes, and Ornithopters, you name it. This is a ridiculous card. And the fact that it's an artifact itself, if you go Pinnacle Emissary into Pinnacle Emissary, the first one, you casting the second one triggers the first one. Is ridiculous card. Seed Ship Brood Tender. For a black and a green, we have a creature insect citizen at uncommon. It is a 2/3 that says when this enters, mill 3 cards, and then for 3 black, green, and sacrifice this creature, return target creature or spacecraft card from your graveyard to the battlefield, activate only as a sorcery. Interestingly, that you don't have to tap this to get the activation, so you could theoretically attack with it and then reanimate whatever you're planning on reanimating. But this card's just great. You know, it's 2 mana, fuels your graveyard, maybe finds the thing that you're trying to reanimate. Is not the worst stats for 2 mana. 2 mana, 2/3. You know, perfectly fine to play, and then just be able to reanimate something, whether you're reanimating a big bomb or just sort of reanimating like a 4-drop, like any kind of like mid-rangey card that your opponent dealt with. I think this card's perfectly fine. Is this gonna like be the revival of Golgari Graveyard? I'm not sure I'm gonna go that far. Is this going to help Golgari Roots with the rotating of Tyvar Jubilant Brawler? I'm not sure on there, but this is just a decently playable card that could go in mid-range, could go in Jund Reanimator, could go in a lot of places. Next is Singularity Rupture. I'm going on a little bit on a limb on this one, but for 3, a blue, and 2 black, so 6 total mana, we have a sorcery at rare. It says destroy all creatures, then any number of target players each mill half their library rounded down. So currently, pre-rotation, there is sort of a fringe deck, but did literally win the last Worlds, called Dimir Demons, where you play it is every land that you have taps for black, yeah, at least taps for black, and then some of them tap for black and blue. And because there is a 6-drop black, 6 black pips card called Doomsday Excruciator, which ETBs and exiles each player's library until they have only 5 cards left, and the exiles face down, so you don't even know what actually got ripped from your library. You can't figure out what is left if you happen to have, you know, your deck list completely memorized. And then you would play that, and if your opponent can't kill you by the time that you untap, you either play a Jace, the Perfected Mind, in order to mill the remaining cards from your opponent, or you attack with like a Restless Reef in order to mill 4 so that your opponent is going to deck themselves before you deck yourself. So there's that strategy, but Jace, the Perfected Mind, is rotating. You're still going to have Restless Reef, but without Jace, it's a much worse deck. But I do think that there can still be a Dimir deck that has mill as its win condition, and be a relatively viable strategy, because you can do something like Singularity Rupture as either as a board wipe or just as a relatively expensive Traumatize, and play that alongside River Churn Monument from Aether Drift, which for its exhaust, it would mill your opponent equal to the number of cards in that opponent's graveyard. So you Singularity Rupture, get halfway through, you then River Churn Monument to get the rest of the way through. People have tried doing things like this with as well in Standard. Currently, there's an Unearth card that costs 1 blue, and if it deals combat damage to your opponent, I think it's if it deals combat damage rather than on attack, then they mill half their library rounded down, alongside River Churn Monument. I think this being just a board wipe, 6 is pretty expensive, but you can just play this in like a controlling Dimir list. Dimir's already playing 5 mana board wipes with Deadly Cover Up. You can play a couple copies of Singularity Rupture as well, and then alongside Riverturn Monument to sort of 1-2 punch your opponent. So that's really the only reason that I can think that this would be playable. I don't. You can technically target yourself in. You know, there's a world where you can do this and do things like Emmet Selk or something, or like do it with like Reanimator or something like that. But Reanimator stuff really aren't wanting to wipe the board, and you also want to be way ahead of 6 mana. If you're waiting all the way till 6 mana, you're pretty close to being able to just start casting these reanimation targets anyways. So I'm not sure targeting yourself, at least in standard, is that big of a deal. I mostly see it as a 1-2 punch with Riverturn Monument. Next is Station Monitor. For white and a blue, we have a creature Lizard Artificer at uncommon. It is a 2/2 that says whenever you cast your second spell each turn, you create one of those drones, those flying drones that can only block flying, the 1/1s. Nowhere near as powerful as the Is It 3-drop that we saw, but you know, not awful. 2-drop that a 2-drop that generates tokens on second spell. It's not Corey Steelcutter, but it's not that far off, in my opinion. You're trading haste and prowess for flying, but you know, I could see this in some sort of Azorius token strategy, Azorius go wide strategy, Azorius weenies strategy. My sleeper pick of the whole set, I think, Servandum Sunstar Exemplar. For white and a black, we have a legendary creature, Human Knight, at rare. It is a 2/2 with a vigilance and menace. So a little on the weak side, but has very good keywords, vigilance and menace. So can get in with a little bit of evasion and can block. Whenever another creature you control dies or is put into exile, so note that that can be from being warped, because warping is when it gets to its instep trigger would put those creatures into exile. You put a +1/+1 counter on Servandum and you gain 1 life. And then when Servandum dies or is put into exile, while its power is 4 or greater, destroy up to 1 target non-land permanent. So it's a 2-drop. It's an Orzhov 2-drop that cares about sacrifice in the same way that like Gabranth from the Final Fantasy set cares about sacrifice. You know, you're making it a little bit bigger, but you're also gaining life. And a lot of these Raise the Past decks, especially if you're doing the combo Raise the Past stuff, care about life gain. Amalia cares about life gain. Star Shape Cleric, Star Spear Cleric, the bat that drains your opponent for 1 every time that you gain a life, cares about life gain. Essence Channeler cares about life gain if you're doing that kind of stuff. It's also, even if your creatures are being put into exile, you know, even if your opponent played like a Rest in Peace, right? This is going to be able to still grow, even if they're killing your things. with a rest in peace on there, or really that's not gonna happen a ton, but it is out there. Or if you're just warping things, you're playing the black warp creature that can warp from your graveyard. That can start growing Servandom. And then the Servandom's dies or is put into exile trigger when it has 4 power or greater. I don't think it's going to be that difficult in a sacrifice list for you to get Servandom to 4 power or greater. And the very interesting thing I see with that is if your opponent plays a Pinnacle Starcage, or while Servandom has 4 power or greater, the Pinnacle Starcage puts Servandom into the grave or into exile. So the trigger would go on the stack, and then you could blow up the Pinnacle Starcage, and then Servandom comes out of exile along with everything else. So it's just like huge protection against a Pinnacle Starcage. And I didn't play a ton of the Raise the Past stuff in the standard, but I've played a decent amount against it, especially as a Azorius control player. And Temporary Lockdown is a pretty good answer to the Raise the Past list, because you're both clearing out what is often a fairly large board of two mana value creatures, and they're not going into the graveyard so that they just get Raise the Past like you would if you did, like a Day of Judgment or whatever, to deal with that board, or if you did like a split up to deal with that board. And then this just being like, they have to take the time to kill Servandom before they can play their Pinnacle Starcage, which might just be too long. They might just be dead before they get the chance to do it. It works a lot in the same way that things like, like a Zac or like a Selfless Savior, or anything that you can use to give your board hexproof or indestructible. You're just providing a little bit of a step in between, that your opponent, a little bit of a hoop that your opponent has to jump through before they can cleanly deal with your board. On top of the fact that we've got just a 2/2 Vigilance Menace creature that grows with the game plan that you're already doing, this card is just very, very good. I haven't even mentioned the fact that it's a knight. So if you're trying to do any sort of Dion things, this works with Dion. It would gain flying during your turn because he's turning your knights into dragoons. Just a very, very good card. I think mostly would see play in your Raise the Past combo lists. But I think just as overall, just an absolute fine 2-drop. If the Is It card wasn't there, then this would be my my top pick out of Edge of Eternities, outside of the lands, which we'll get to. And then I think this is our last one. We already saw one Tanook. This is the uncommon version of Tanook. Tanook Memorial Ensign for 1 a red, a green. We get a legendary creature, Kavu Pilot, at uncommon. It's a 2/4 with landfall. When lands ETB, you deal 1 damage to each opponent. And if this is the second time this ability resolved this turn, draw a card. I tried experimenting with Jund Landfall when Final Fantasy came out, because you had both the 1-drop lizard that had this ping an opponent when land enter on for landfall triggers, and then they printed Sabotender at 2 mana for 1 and a red to do the same thing. Now you have Tanook at 3 mana, do the same thing. You're getting a critical mass of this stuff going on. So I think that there is a landfall deck, Jund landfall deck, that can be slapped together in standard. And I want to give it another shot. One of the big reasons why it didn't work the first time is just Quarry Steelcutter was such a menace that you just didn't have time to do any stuff like that. I think the format's slowed down enough that you can give it a shot. And comboing this with things like Titan or like Aftermath Analyst or Lumra or like big combo kills or even just sort of aggro-ish draws with your landfall stuff, just adding additional pings. Having 12 copies of that effect in standard seems pretty good to me. That's it for the multicolored cards. On now to our colorless cards, and this is going to include lands as well. Our colorless, our artifacts, and our lands. I don't think I forgot to actually pull out the cards to review, so I'll quickly do that. I have the ones that I want. Then there we go. So let's do here. So first up, very first card in set numbering, Anti-Causal Vestige. For 6 generic, we have a creature Eldrazi, the only Eldrazi in the set, at rare. It is a 7/5 that has, when this creature leaves the battlefield, draw a card, then you may put a permanent with a mana value less than or equal to the number of lands you control from your hand onto the battlefield tapped. And then it has Warp for 4 generic. So in normal scenarios, you warp this on turn 4. You probably have 4 lands in play. Even if they shoot this, because it is a creature, when you warp it, it'll be on the battlefield for until you hit your end step. It's a leaves the battlefield trigger, so even if they deal with this at instant speed, you'll still get this trigger. You can immediately put in another thing that costs 4. Plus you draw a card. So you're essentially, how I kind of see that the warp part of this is you're essentially mana fixing to cast something that you already were going to cast that turn, but also draw a card. Sure, if they counter Anti-Causal Vestige when you cast it for its warp cost, then you're not able to cast whatever you were actually going to cast. But I think that's, they could have just countered the thing that you wanted to cast. So you're kind of protecting the thing that you wanted to cast, because this is a trigger that just puts it into play rather than puts it onto the stack to be interacted with in that way. And you get the card draw alongside it. It's written pretty well so that you can't like cheat too heavily with Anti-Causal Vestige. You have to have a particular, it's based off of the number of lands that you have, It's specifically looking at mana value rather than the amount of mana that you spent for it. But you're essentially doing the thing that you were going to do anyways, but you got to draw a card for it. And then you also still have access to the anti-causal vestige in your warp zone to then just play it as a 7/5 for 6, which is, it's kind of just, you know, like whatever stat wise. It's 6 mana, no ETB. You can probably do a little bit better than that, but the fact that you had access to this earlier to get something to get that card draw, pseudo card draw, in the fact that you still have access to it to warp from the warp zone later, still have access to the anti-causal vestige from the warp zone later, and then if they ever deal with the anti-causal vestige, then you can drop something else onto the board. It's a weird card. I don't know if it's like breakable, but I do think that it is decent value. And especially if you can do like the Tanook stuff or the full bore stuff, getting this out and smashing your opponent can be pretty powerful. So really just a weird card that I think is more value than anything. Than any sort of like cheat. Tezzeret Cruel Captain. For 3 generic, we have a legendary planeswalker Tezzeret and Mythic. It is as 4 starting loyalty. And then whenever an artifact you control enters, put a loyalty counter on Tezzeret. For 0 loyalty points, you can untap an target artifact or creature. If it's an artifact creature, put a +1/+1 counter on it. You can also -3, remove 3 loyalty counters from it to search your library for an artifact card with mana value 1 or less, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle. Note that could be like an artifact land with the -3, and then -7, you get an emblem with at the beginning of combat on your turn, put 3 +1/+1 counters on target artifact you control. If it's not a creature, it becomes a 0/0 robot artifact creature. I mostly bring this up because I don't think that this is going to be that relevant in standard, at least from what we have so far. It's very powerful in older formats in the same way that the Izzet card is very powerful in older formats, because you have 0 cost artifacts. You have super powerful things with activated ability, like Time Vault, that you can use the untap for with Tezzeret. 0 cost artifacts means that you can get to you can vary, like, the turn that you play Tezzeret, immediately get to the point where you can ultimate Tezzeret. So I think that this is a card that's not really for standard. I think it's for older formats. It'll be interesting if somebody can break it in the standard, and by interesting I mean it'll probably be terrible to play against, because you'll just feel awful playing against this if it can get broken. But I think that this is mostly here for older formats. Extinguisher Battleship. For 8 generic, we have an artifact spacecraft at rare. It has an ETB of when the spacecraft enters, destroy target non-creature permanent. Then this spacecraft deals 4 damage to each creature. It also has station. It turns into a creature at 5 charge counters, and it has flying and trample, and is a 10/10. I think this is one of your better, like, ramp targets, colorless ramp target in like an Ugin deck. If you're already trying to do like heavily ramp into Ugin, then extinguish a battleship, is kind of a board wipe that also blows up, you know, problematic non-creature permanents. Notably, it does hit a land. It can hit a land with the destroy target, so that can be interesting. Other thing to note, it is an artifact, so if you have Tanook, you can warp this out. Tanook has 5 toughness, so warping this out wouldn't kill Tanook, so you don't have to worry about that. So 8 mana is a lot of mana, but I think that both this with Tanook and just in any kind of Ugin deck that's already trying to ramp into Ugin, perfectly reasonable to play this card. It's colorless itself, so it triggers Ugin, so you get both the Ugin cast trigger to blow up something, and then this enters the battlefield trigger to blow up more things. And it only takes 5 charge counters to actually become a creature, so relatively easy to turn on as a spacecraft. So super high costed, but not unreasonable. There are decks that already are trying to cast things of similar mana value. And then we're on to the Shocklands. We just have the 5 Shocklands here: Breeding Pool, Godless Shrine, Sacred Foundry, Stomping Ground, and Watery Grave. I talked pretty extensively about these cards in my rotation stream last week, so if you want to know a lot more details about these cards, obviously super powerful dual lands, probably the best dual lands that you could have in a standard environment. They've printed them into standard many times. They constantly go back to them because they are the right power level, they are modern power level, and they are standard power level. Just very, very good. The imbalance of colors, I went much more into that into the in the review, the set review, but this, when you are making your deck building choices, you're probably going to want to lean into these colors: your Demirs, your Gruuls, your Boroses, your Orzovs, and your Simics, rather than your Azoriuses, your Selesnias, your Rakdoses, God, your Izzets, and your whatever the last one is. I can't think of it. So mostly keep that in mind. These work very well with the Verges because they themselves are islands or swamps. So just like with the Surveil lands, these turn on your Verges. Notable thing for me, I have none of the cycle of planets. So there's a cycle of 1 for each color planets that are ETB tapped lands that have station. They turn on at all of them, gain some new ability at 12 total, 12 or more charge counters, and their abilities are, range from, kind of middling to, hey, this is, you remember this card? Wow, look at this. We printed it in standard. You're not going to get full, or don't worry, we're not fooling you this time. This is just as powerful as Gaia's Cradle and Tolarian Academy. I think all of them are borderline unplayable. Even the Gaia's Cradle and the Tolarian Academy ones. Sorcery speed to turn them on. You're just slowing your game plan. You're either slowing your game plan down too much, not killing your opponent, and leaving yourself vulnerable to being killed by your opponent because you can't block with the creatures that are stationing. If you use those creatures to station up something, you can't block with them. There is, there's little bits of synergy with things like Survivor from Duskmourn, and then there's a decent amount of cards that care about how many tapped things that you have in this set. And the fact that comes attached to a land means that you have sort of a free access to being able to tap things at sorcery speed at will, but I think you're stretching pretty heavily for making any of those planets viable in competitive standard. And I think with all that, we are done with our overall review. I don't think that the set is certainly not as powerful as Duskmourn, Bloomburrow, even Tarkir Dragonstorm. I think it's kind of on the level of the Final Fantasy set, which looked like an absolute dud, but that's really because Standard was just so inhospitable to like anything that wasn't Corey Steelcutter or Mono Red Aggro. We've seen post banning that cards like Tifa, Yuna, Cecil, Sephiroth have all seen a decent amount of play in Standard, and I think you're going to see sort of similar things happen with this set. Obviously, the biggest contribution that this set's going to give is the Shocklands, but I think that there will be a number of cards coming out of this set that both contribute to already existing archetypes and have the potential to spawn new ones. So I think overall it's fine. I'm super disappointed in Station as a mechanic. I think that it is, from a competitive constructed perspective, it is a big miss. Whether it is fun and good and limited, I do not know. I won't know. I won't know until I play the limited environment, and I haven't really played limited in a very long time. So probably not going to be able to give any perspective on that, even retrospectively, outside of just parroting what others might have said about it, the limited environment. But from competitive constructed, there's like very few reasons to play any of these spacecraft or planets or cards with Station. I think Warp is super interesting from a constructed card. It's just better-ish evoke. I think Void is okay as a mechanic. There aren't a ton of Void cards that I think are that playable, but I think the mechanic itself is fine. Fixing Revolt so that it doesn't so that you can't crack fetch lands and trigger Revolt is so that you can't crack fetch lands and trigger Void is good, and then having it work with the set mechanic, very similar to what they did with Eerie, in that it's just Constellation that also works with the set mechanic, and I think Eerie was perfectly fine. But yeah, not much else to say. We're done with everything from Edge of Eternities. I think I do still want to go back to my Final Fantasy wrap-up stream and comment on what I thought about it, and, you know, retrospectively look at it. Might end up waiting. Don't know if I'll do that now. One, because it's just like this stream, it's rambling and gonna take a while, so I might want to try and condense my thoughts down to something a little more palatable that I can react to. And two, it might be better to wait all the way until Final Fantasy rotates before I make a full declaration, because obviously there could be something printed in the Spider-Man set that just absolutely breaks Cloud in half. Who knows? But yeah. That's gonna do it for the stream. Thank you so much for watching. There've been a couple people who popped on in, who've been lurking. Anybody who watches live or watches in the VOD, I appreciate you regardless. And yeah, like I said, I might come back for another stream of retrospection now. I might end up waiting until later. If you don't see me for that stream, then you'll probably see me whenever the Spider-Man set starts getting spoiled. Don't know if I'm going to try and get into Magic the Gathering content creation, try and do, like, you know, playing decks and stuff like that. Not really my thing. I like doing that on my own, but I do really enjoy doing these set reviews and yapping about my thoughts for them. So with all of that, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.